All right, guys. Word of the day. Word of the day. We are going to talk about photosynthesis today. It can get a little complicated. We will try to break it down so it's not so complicated. But no better place to start than with the general formula for photosynthesis. If you don't already know it, you definitely better commit this one to memory. Oh, yeah. This is the easy part, knowing this. Okay. In other words, as we go over some of these details today, don't lose sight of the big picture here. Okay, photosynthesis. Well, think about this. Plants, okay, and some algae and some protists are able to perform photosynthesis. Not all of them, but some protists. Remember, the whole point of photosynthesis we talked about earlier is that you are taking a couple of small reactants, small ingredients, CO2, and when it's all said and done, you're going to build up that CO2 to something really complex like sugar. It's a big molecule here. The whole point of photosynthesis, and I'll even put a star right by it, is to make that sugar. That's what plants do. They make sugar. They make sugar for the rest of the food chain to eat. That's their goal. Okay. So really what you're going to end up seeing, you're going to see this carbon dioxide here get built up to do this. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of that's got to be kind of a long process. You've got to put a lot of atoms in there. It does. You do. In order to make photosynthesis go, it's going to require energy. Okay, it's going to require the sun. Okay, of course. One of the other big ingredients photosynthesis needs is water. Okay. When it's all said and done, sugar is the main idea, and this is more like a waste product. This is oxygen. Now, obviously, it's not a waste product to us, but it's just kind of one of those extra side products. A great OGT kind of question that they would ask about photosynthesis is this. They like you to understand how energy changes forms on that test. That's one thing. They like you to know all different types of energies and how it changes forms. In this particular process of photosynthesis, you're taking light energy and you're actually making sugar, but remember what sugar is. Sugar is a chemical. You're making chemical energy. We talked about chemical energy last year. Chemical energy is the energy stored in bonds of atoms. Bonds, B-O-N-D-S. Well, there's a lot of C's, H's, and O's there. A lot of chemical energy. So you're taking light energy and you're changing it into chemical energy. A usable form for all the other organisms on Earth. Okay. Not all organisms are lucky enough to be able to just make their own food, so we better find a way to eat what they make. So that's what this is all about. Okay. Excellent. Let's move along. Photosynthesis can get a little detailed, but before we get to the details of the actual process, you need to remember a couple of things from last year. Oh, wow. Do you remember this thing?
Yeah. I do.
Hey, it's a good idea to kind of reflect back on this thing too. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, when we were talking in physical science about forms of energy, forms of light energy in particular, this was kind of brought up, forms of light energy. And here's the only thing I want you to kind of get out of this. There are a lot of different forms of light energy, but we as humans can only see a very narrow range on this scale. Very narrow range right here. Okay, those are the forms of light energy we can see. They kind of blew them up here. In other words, this is what this means. If wavelength of energy, light energy, enters your eyes at a wavelength of 700 nanometers, you're going to see red. Pretty cool. If a wavelength of light energy comes into your eyes at a wavelength of 500 nanometers, you're pretty much going to see green. Cool. Okay. Hey, remember how we can take white light and we can pass it through like a prism, and you can get all these different colors. In other words, another thing you kind of have to remember here is the sun up there, which is supplying all the light energy, is basically white light, which is a combination of all colors. Okay, why in the world would Mrs. Hatcher kind of bring this up? Well, plants don't really use all these wavelengths of light. They're kind of choosy. Plants are choosy as to what they take. So I kind of wanted to kind of set that, and then I wanted to show you this, which actually is a lot easier than it looks. Okay, I just got done telling you that plants are choosy. Plants are picky about what wavelengths of light they want. Only certain wavelengths of light will work for photosynthesis, not all of them. And that's what this graph shows. This graph is definitely telling me what are those wavelengths of light that plant like. Everywhere you see a peak, and it has a general pattern, but everywhere you see the peaks, those are the wavelengths of light that the plant loves. It almost looks flip-flopped in your mind, though, at first, because you're like, well, wait a minute. I don't see a peak at green. Why? No, because plants... Green wavelengths of light does nothing for a plant. Nothing. But blue, violet, orange, those wavelengths of light, a plant will definitely sponge up like a sponge. That's what the word absorption means. So this is basically the light absorption by photosynthetic pigments. In other words, that's a fancy way of saying, okay, these are the wavelengths of light that a plant will absorb to make photosynthesis go. Well, if you learned from last year, when it comes to an object, they're either going to absorb a wavelength of light or they're going to what it. If they don't absorb it, what are they going to do to it? Reject it or reflect it. Okay, this is why we see plants as green. Actually, that's right. They're going to reject it. They're like, you know what? Green light does absolutely nothing for me. Bam, sending it back in the other direction. But that's reflecting. That's why we see green plants. That's why we see plants as green, is because those are the wavelengths of light that the plant doesn't need. So that's what this graph is saying. So now it makes sense that there are no peaks at green and yellow, the color that are most plants, because basically those colors are getting reflected away from the plant. Plant's not using them, but those are the wavelengths that enter our eye. When we look at a plant, chances are we are seeing 550 nanometers into our eye. That's why we interpret it as green. Light is a really weird thing to understand, the way light works, the way our eyes work detecting it. Okay, so we kind of have to remember that. I want you to be able to read this kind of a chart. All right, a couple other basics we need to go over before we go into the details here a little bit. Here's kind of a nice little overview of photosynthesis, nice little simple chart. Again, it's telling you kind of what you saw on the board, and I want you to know this. Plants need sunlight, plants need carbon dioxide, plants need water. In the end, their main product, sugar. And they're going to poop out a little oxygen, too. Dang.
Yeah.
Wake up. Okay.
I'm waiting.
One more picture. This thing is a chloroplast. Well, there's no sense talking about photosynthesis if I don't tell you where it takes place. You guys remember from parts of the cell, you guys pretty much figured out that a chloroplast is the site of photosynthesis. In other words, photosynthesis is going to take place in these. Remember, only plant cells have it. We do not have these things in our cells, so we can't perform photosynthesis. Couple parts you need to keep in mind for this process, though. Two things. These little dark green things that look like pancakes are called thylakoids. You do need to know that name, thylakoid. In fact, I think we already learned that way back when we were talking about a chloroplast, but here it really applies. The very first phase of photosynthesis is going to take place in this thylakoid. Inside those thylakoids is where all those pigments, those chlorophylls are at, all those pigments that are needed. So basically, almost consider them like big pancakes filled with syrup, but the syrup inside of it are the chlorophylls and the other pigments. Okay. Part 1 is going to happen there. Part 2 is going to actually, photosynthesis is going to happen just in the space outside the thylakoids called the stroma. Stroma. So that's the other important word you need to know when it comes to a chloroplast. Okay. All right, let's get started here. Let's talk about some details. Okay, actually before I do that, it's always nice to have a visual. Okay, the next thing I'm going to be talking to you about are the phases of photosynthesis. There's 2 of them. That's nice. There's only 2 things to kind of know. That happens. It's a 2-step program. The first set of reactions, the first part of photosynthesis is what takes place in those thylakoids. That's why you see them. Light is needed for those. That's why they're going to be called the light-dependent reactions. Light is needed. I love this overhead. This is good. The whole function of the first set of reactions is to make this and to make this, which we'll talk about in a minute. I haven't made my sugars yet, that's for sure. I haven't even come close to making my sugars yet in the first step. The only thing I've done in the first step, it takes light and water, and it gets really complicated, but basically when it's all said and done at the end of this reaction, you're going to make this and you're going to make that. Well, you need that. Consider that as like a first step to making your sugar. You're never going to be able to make sugar without the power. That's what the first stages did. So in the second set of reactions, we're going to use that ATP, we're going to use that other NADPH. That should look familiar, by the way. Here's where carbon dioxide enters the picture. Carbon dioxide is going to come on in, a little tiny molecule, going to come on in, and with the help of ATP and NADPH, some magic's going to happen, and your sugars are going to come out. Okay, that's it. That's basically photosynthesis in a nutshell. It's really not, two-part process. Okay, let me kind of write down. I want you guys to write down some of the basics here. That's a good important. I may make a copy of this for everybody, actually, because that's a good one to probably know. All right. Do you want that? Yep. That's a good one. I like that.
Earthquake! What? I didn't do that.
Alright, guys. Let's write down some key points. Photosynthesis.
Oh, you got to write it down.
There are the light-dependent reactions. Light-dependent. If you're dependent on something, you need it. Well, these reactions definitely need light. The other ones are the light-independent reactions. These reactions could care less if light is there. They're going to happen regardless of whether light's around. It's not like light will hurt them, but they could care less about whether it's around. I'll even say light not needed. Okay. The light-dependent reactions, those take place in the thylakoids. Remember, those are those pancakes. That's important. The pigments that are most definitely needed in photosynthesis are found in the thylakoids. So again, just kind of think of these thylakoids like, squishy pancakes with pigments on the inside. By the way, the pigments, that's what the chlorophyll molecule are. The chlorophyll is the pigment that's the most popular pigment that's used in photosynthesis. But there's more than just one. There's a bunch of different pigments. Funny, we see those pigments, other pigments right now if you take a look outside. I don't know if you guys realize this. I probably should refresh your memory. Here's what happens in the fall. Chlorophyll plus many others. There are a lot of pigments in plants. Chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids, I can go on. There are all these big words, okay? They refer to all these pigments that are found inside of plants. Well, what happens is this. The chlorophyll ones are the ones that make plants green. Those are the ones that are reflecting green, these chlorophyll pigments. That's why most plants are green. Here's what happens in the fall. I don't know if you guys realize this, but plants actually have a lot of hormones inside of them, just like we do. Now, the hormones aren't the same, but they have plant hormones, different hormones. And it's about this time every year that the amount of daylight kind of changes, the temperature kind of changes, and it sends signals to all the cells in the plant that, you know what, it's time to make some changes here. Photosynthesis is a very energy-consuming process. So by basically shedding the leaves off of trees, they're kind of saving energy. So that's why plants do it. Plants lose their leaves in order to save energy. But the plant knows to shed its leaf when these hormones are sent through it saying, okay, time to do it. And those hormones are always sent out based on length of day and temperature and things. So what ends up happening is the leaves change color because chlorophyll is the first pigment that starts breaking down. Literally, all the chlorophyll molecules, all the chlorophyll molecules inside of a leaf literally break apart. Okay. Well, if the chlorophyll molecules are breaking apart, all those other ones are kind of later to break apart. And the later ones, all those pigments that kind of break down last are the ones that are orange and red and yellow kind of deal. So this is what the point is. Even in the summer, when you see the plants out there, you see leaves all over the place and everything's green. You got to understand that all these other pigments that are inside of leaves are there, but they're just being masked by the chlorophyll, which is there in greater quantity. So anyway, all right, light-dependent reactions. You've got these thylakoids, you've got the pigments located inside of them, and I'm going to write down the word absorption spectrum because I'm not going to draw it, but I want you guys to remember that picture I put up on the board of the absorption spectrum. And the main gist of that was that the green wavelengths of light are reflected, and it's the blue and the violet and the orange wavelengths of light that are mostly absorbed. In other words, I'll put a little star by it because those are the wavelengths of light that really a plant is going to use to power photosynthesis. They don't care about green. If you took a green light and you went into a little room with a plant, and it was the brightest green light you could possibly have, and you shined it on that plant, the plant would die. They don't want green light. But if you went into that same room, got rid of the green light, and brought in a blue light, and shined it on the plant would live. Pretty crazy. Okay. Here's what I'm going to say. Light-dependent reactions. The whole goal of the light-dependent reactions are to make ATP and to make something called NADPH, which should look very familiar to you guys if you were paying attention to the cellular respiration process. This molecule is also an electron carrier. It carries electrons. Okay? It's basically a molecule that's going to carry electrons and dump them where they're needed. Same thing. In other words, it's an energy source, just like ATP is, just a little different. You have ATP, you have NADPH made in the first reactions. That's crucial. But notice, I haven't made my sugar yet, but I've definitely made the power that I need to make my sugar. The light-independent reactions, that's where these things are going to go. I'm even going to draw a little arrow. ATP and NADPH are going to eventually go over here. And what's going to happen is this. CO2 is going to enter the picture. So you guys all know that plants need CO2. They need carbon dioxide in order to be happy. Well, here it comes into play. That CO2 is going to enter a cycle. And so I'm drawing it like a circle because the light-independent reactions are a cycle. Kind of like the Krebs cycle was before. However, this ATP that I just made is going to also enter. This NADPH that I just made is going to enter. And those are going to be like the gasoline that basically is going to take CO2 and build it up. Look at that. CO2 is just a measly little tiny molecule. But when it's all said and done, at the end of this, you're going to pop out your sugars. In other words, you're using ATP and NADPH to turn CO2 into sugars. A couple of side notes. This takes place in the stroma. The name of the process where carbon dioxide does its transformation is called carbon fixation. It's when CO2 gets changed into an organic compound. Sugar is an organic compound. I want you to know that word, carbon fixation, because it basically refers to the fact that you're taking little CO2 and you're building it up into a major giant molecule of sugar. And that's the whole point of photosynthesis, is to make sugar. All right. Let's see if I can find an easier overhead that kind of sums this up. Yeah, everybody's kind of a little out of it today.
Oh.
This one's not the best one, but at least it's a picture to stare at. Overview of photosynthesis. Yeah, just look at it a while. See if you can make sense out of it.
I tried.
One back.
That one's easier. Both will, yeah, you know what, let me have that one back again. That one's better, so, but this one I'll show anyway. This one's not the easiest one to read, but I'm going to show it anyway. All right, all I did was I wrote the formula at the very top for the overview of photosynthesis, but down here they kind of break it up into phases. So we've already talked about all these. Remember I said stage 1. That's why you see these little pancakes, because stage 1 happens in the thylakoids. Here's where sunlight's going to come in, and the whole point of them is to make this and to make this. That's why they kind of have arrows. That's the whole point of stage 1. Now, at the same time, it requires water to do it, and at the same time, oxygen's going to be made too. But really, the whole point of stage 1 is to power up the process. Then this basically shows, okay, now that this is made, the ATP and NADPH are made, they're going to be shoved into a cycle along with carbon dioxide, and when it's all said and done, you're going to be making your sugars over here. So now we see kind of all these steps, this whole overview of photosynthesis, to kind of see where it's all coming in. And going out, actually, for that matter. Kind of complicated. Photosynthesis can get really scary looking, too. Again, this is a better overhead, showing you the two phases. I like this one better. Light dependent, light comes in. The whole point, make ATP and NADPH, which is going to be used for the second part, along with CO2, to make your sugars. Take place in, now remember, this whole green thing, we're still in the chloroplast, but we're in different parts of the chloroplast depending on which reaction you're doing. Alright, that's about as much detailed photosynthesis as I think I'm going to get in here. What am I forgetting to do with you guys? So I'm ending it really early.
I'm not the way to start asking other things.
What are you?
That's it.
We're gonna have to go home.
Well, we took notes. We took notes Thursday, we did.
Yeah, you guys are a little different from the other class. We got a little farther than we did in the other class, so maybe that's it.
Can we study our vocab?
Hmm?
Can we just study our vocab?
Can we carry our vocab and partner?
Jordan, let's be glad.
Jordan, don't be so negative.
Now do this. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, as long as I have the time, I'm actually going to give you guys a little fun quiz. So, rip out a scrap sheet of paper.
I got your recorder off.
Rip out a scratch sheet of paper
Hope you didn't care if I
and give it
did
to
this.
your friend if they need it.
Hope you didn't care if I did yours.
Actually, paper.